So what kind of led me to this life path actually was starting martial arts as a child. When I was pretty young, my dad was stationed in Okinawa briefly, and we were over there with him. And I remember seeing a martial arts demo as a small child, right? And I became fascinated with it. It was something that just I wanted to be able to do. And we come back to the States, and it was much rarer then than it is now. There was no, MMA. It was hard to find more eclectic modern martial arts. So I started with like karate, judo, and aikido, like the big ones they had back then, right? And I wound up competing nationally in karate, which is not like it is today. Like today, it's an activity for kids. Back then, it was an activity for pretty tough adults. It was pretty rough and tumble. We didn't use pads. Basically, if you didn't draw blood, you didn't get in trouble, even though it wasn't technically contact fighting, right? And I wound up competing in the adult divisions as a teenager and actually getting a bronze at nationals one year. And I had spent all this time learning about conflict and fighting and how to train myself. And I wanted it to really mean something. I didn't just want it to be a sport or like a sporting activity. And pretty much kind of the logical concept in my young brain then was to go from that to the military, because if you think about it, martial arts were really intended to be arts for war. That's what martial means, right? So I joined the Army. Joined the Army young. I went to 1st Ranger Battalion, and I discovered very shortly, and this I don't think would be true the same way today, because Ranger Regiment today is a very different animal than it was in the early 90s, right? But coming right off the street and going into Ranger Regiment, it was not the environment I was ideally suited for at the time. I was too questioning of authority, and I was too much into finding the smart way to do things, and it was hard for me to take things at face value. I also didn't have, despite growing up with a military father, I was still a civilian. I didn't have that military discipline kind of beaten into me yet, right? So now I'm really glad I went there, because they beat the civilian out of me and made me a good soldier, but it was a painful process. It did not come easy to me. But I still remember out in the field, I was a private in Ranger Regiment, and we watched the little birds come in, and the guys sitting on the skids of the little birds were in tattered BDU pants and old rock and roll t-shirts, and their hair was touching their ears, and they were wearing gym shoes and sunglasses, and I had just shaved in the field and spit shined my boots after being in the field for 2 weeks. So right then and there, I knew I had to go to selection, right? I had to go to selection. So I went to selection and was fortunate enough to get selected my first time. Now, while I was in the process, in the pipeline for Special Forces, Mogadishu happened, which meant that basically Special Operations got benched. All we were doing was FID missions. I went through selection from 20th Special Forces Group, and at the time I wasn't sure if I was going to go on active duty after the Q course or stay in 20th Group. And I was talking to a bunch of guys on active duty, some guys from the unit, some guys from Whiteside SF, and they all said the same thing. They all said, because I had briefly been a cop between active duty and Ranger Regiment while I was going through the process to go to selection through 20th Group. And they all said the same thing. They were all like, you enjoyed being a cop, you can go to a big city, get your action that way, and still stay in 20th Group and get all the training and do the FID missions and go to Central and South America and enjoy yourself doing that and have the best of both worlds. Because at the time, under the administration that was in place in America, we weren't really sure if the military was ever really going to do anything again. Everything was very much on hold, very low budget, very, very low manpower, very kind of low ambition for aims and goals, right? So I looked around for the biggest, nastiest, most messed up city I could find to go be a cop in, so I went to Chicago. I then spent 21 years in Chicago. Now, while I was there, I'd been there maybe 3 years. I'd been there 3 years and the towers fell, and the whole world changed. All of a sudden, being in the National Guard SF was no longer just going to Central and South America and training foreign troops, right? Now we were doing pumps to Afghanistan and Iraq. So for the next, roughly 20 years, I bounced back and forth between both jobs, which was great for me because both jobs have their bureaucracy you have to deal with, and both have their things that aggravate you and burn you out, but they're different. So whenever I would get burned out with being a Chicago cop, I'd just go hop on a deployment Then when I would get burned out with the Army, it would be time to come back already from the deployment, and I'd go back to being a cop. And it kind of kept things fresh for me and kept me from getting too burned out or aggravated with either one of the professions. Plus it was great because I got full credit for 2 careers and basically did half of each. So I got over that way, right? Now, for what I do now, I think that gave me a very unique perspective because I know plenty of people who have done either one of those jobs at the level I did. But I don't really know anybody who did both of them to the same level I did. And while the principles of conflict are universal, right? The principles that underline tactics and techniques and all of that are the same. The way you apply those principles varies widely based on your rules of engagement, your operational environment, optics, stated, mission sets, end goals, all those things. So I think I have a better perspective for being able to transfer the lessons learned from either one to the other than I would if I'd only done one. And I think that stood me in really good stead with my business and what I'm doing now. Now, the third piece of the puzzle is that I was always comfortably among the best shots anytime I went to the range in either job, except for the people that competed heavily in action shooting sports, right? I had 2 friends in particular that were both USPSA Grandmasters, as well as being on SWAT in Chicago and being in 20th Special Forces Group. And both of these friends have been urging me for years to do competition. And I will admit that I was very resistant at first for all the cliche reasons guys in those lines of work are resistant, right? That's a game, it's a sport. I'm a fighter, not a racer. You know what I mean? All those standard arguments you hear, right? But after shooting with my buddies enough that were GMs, I realized that regardless of any of those things, they could outshoot me. They were better than I was at a skill that mattered for my job. And that didn't sit well with me, so I decided to go ahead and try USPSA out. Now, me being me with my personality type, I waited until wintertime in Chicagoland to look for a USPSA match, which anybody that's ever lived up north in the Midwest knows that that is not conducive to an outdoor match, right? So I found this little small indoor weeknight match up in McHenry, Illinois, about an hour and a half north of the city. And called up the guy that ran the club, asked if I could come shoot. We knew a bunch of the same people. He invited me up. And I showed up comfortably arrogant. I'm like, I'm a good shooter. I'm not that far behind my buddies that are GMs. I won't win the match probably, but I'll do good. Cue the voice in the back of my head going, but in fact, he did not do well. I showed up to this match and it was ugly. They curb stomped me and stole my lunch money. They sent me crying back home to suck my thumb under my whoopee on the couch. It was bad, right? What I didn't realize when I went to this match is that at an indoor 2-bay USPSA match that had 30 shooters, 7 of them were Grandmasters and 10 were Masters, and 2 of the Grandmasters were top 20 nationally. So it was a pretty steep curve at this little local club, right? And that was the first time I'd seen how good really is up close and personal. Like I'd seen the guys we brought in to train when I was in SF. I had all the old, VHS tapes, how to shoot fast and accurately, all that stuff. But it's one thing to watch it on video. It's another thing to shoot the exact same stage before the guy gets up and just burns it down and makes you look like you're geriatric and impaired, right? Totally different experience. So after they took my lunch money and sent me crying home, I could have done what a lot of people in my lines of work do, which is write it off as that's just a game. It's not tactics, it's just a game. I'm a gunfighter, I'm not I don't play a game, I don't play bowling with guns, I'm not in the bowling league with pistols, right? I could have made all these intellectual arguments and justifications to myself to soothe my ego and decide that I didn't really need to do it. But I made the conscious decision that these guys could outshoot me. Regardless of the things that are gamesmanship, I could not shoot the way they could shoot. And I wanted to be able to shoot like they could shoot. So I started doing USPSA pretty seriously. And I made Master in 3 months, which I'm pretty proud of. Now the hit factors were different then, it was easier then, but that was still a pretty good accomplishment, I thought. But then I promptly got stuck. The things that I had done in my training and the things that I was doing technically up to that point got me to a pretty high level, but had now become limiting factors. I was never going to be able to get better than I was if I didn't change the way I trained and change the way I shot. So that started this very painful personal growth process where I basically deconstructed my training for firearms and my technique for firearms and re-engineered them from the ground up. I trained with top USPSA shooters. I did a deep dive into like sports psychology and exercise physiology and sports coaching, trying to figure out the combination of factors that I needed to be able to coach myself to get better at this and to get rid of all the old habits I had from decades of shooting from institutional training, right? And that took years. It finally happened through a lot of work, but it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been willing to set my ego aside and take my lumps and keep showing up. And that's the third piece of the puzzle that I think makes me good at training people with firearms now, is that I have all three pieces at a level that I don't think anybody's done all three at. I know people that have done one or two of them at a pretty high level, but I don't really know, and there may be someone, but I don't really know anybody else who's a GM, was a SWAT guy in a big city and ran the training for the SWAT team and was also a Green Beret and has combat time. Now they may be out there, I'm not saying they're not, but I don't personally know them. And I like the perspective it gives me, especially because kind of my mission with my company is to teach people how to train themselves. Because the idea is there's only so much improvement I'm going to be able to give you in a 2-day class, right? Sometimes people have this like magic light bulb moment and they level up and they have like this demonstrably improved level of skill after 2 days. That's not typical. What usually happens is you go to a class, you shoot a lot for 2 days, and you learn what you should be doing on your own, but then if you don't follow up on it, you don't get better. And the problem is you've got to know how to follow up on it. You've got to know how to organize your training, how to set up your training plans, how to self-diagnose, self-coach, all of those things, right? And that's what I really believe is the key that I need to get across to people. And that's what I try to do in my company, right? So the company I started when I retired is called Greybeard Actual. And I teach, firearms and I teach tactics. I teach a little bit of tactics for civilians, more like the pure self-defense stuff, but I'll do things for SWAT teams where it's CQB and vehicle tactics and all that. A lot of performance shooting also, and the performance shooting piece is equally applicable for defensive shooters, law enforcement, military, and competitive shooters. Because performance is performance. The shooting part doesn't change. Just the way you apply the shooting part changes, right? The application changes, the skills do not. Now, the reason I named the company Greybeard Actual, everybody thinks it's because I'm getting old and gray now, which I am, right? But it's actually not. The Greybeards in the name aren't me, right? My last trip to Afghanistan, my A-team, my SFODA, was the oldest chronologically probably in the whole regiment. I'm sure it was the oldest in our battalion, because I knew that for a fact. Our commander had the record in the regiment for the longest time in command of a single team. And you can't duplicate his record because they've changed the rules so you can't do it. Like nobody else will ever be able to match it. He ran the same ODA for over 20 years, which is unheard of. My team sergeant had been in 5th Group hunting scuds in the 1st Gulf War. His father was the commander of a classified SF unit behind the Berlin Wall. Like this amount of experience just isn't normal, right? Usually guys do a few, you do longer on the team if you're enlisted, but even then you eventually get bumped up to the B team, right? And the officers usually get bumped up to the B team in like 18 months, maybe 24 months in the Guard, because the pace is a bit slower, the turnover is a bit slower, but the time is limited. But I had a team where guys had decades of experience working together, which is like unheard of, right? And I was either the oldest of the young guys on the team or the youngest of the old guys, depending on how you looked at it. So I was still young enough that my seniors were definitely mentoring me, but I was old enough that all the juniors on the team, I would mentor them. So I was kind of in the middle. And where the name comes from is we did a hit in Afghanistan. It was meant to be just a few hours and we wound up fighting for several days. So we haven't slept in a couple days. We've been fighting nonstop. We've called in close air support, all this stuff, right? Just all kinds of fighting. And finally the fighting dies down and it's time to get out of there. Now, the only PZ we could use was this little hilltop right outside the village we've been fighting in, totally exposed. So what we were gonna do is Dave and I, the senior 18 Delta, we were gonna take 2 squads of Afghans out there and secure the perimeter, right, and hold it, and the birds would come in and everybody else was in covered and concealed positions, and they'd book on out and hop on the birds when the birds landed. So Dave and I go out there with the Afghans and we set up the perimeter. And the birds are coming in. They haven't come in. We can't see them yet, but we know they're on their way, right? And the ICOMs start to chatter. The walkie-talkies the bad guys use, and they're not encrypted. So my interpreter comes running up to me. He goes, "Commander Matt, the Taliban are on the ICOMs. They say, get your guns, we get revenge for our fallen brothers. We go kill the infidels." I'm like, all right, we're gonna fight some more. So I give my marching orders to the Afghans, and we get on the horn and we tell the birds to just go ahead and racetrack around the village and wait for us because we're about to get in some more fighting. And I call up Rick, my team sergeant. I'm like, hey, they're about to hit us again. And Rick's like, well, we'll stay in the covered and concealed positions. You guys go ahead and hold down that hilltop. When they attack you, we're gonna flank them and take them out. I'm like, all right, good deal. So we're set up and we're waiting. And I'm waiting. And I'm waiting. And this goes on, it was like 45 minutes, but it seemed like 3 years because we've been up for 3 days. And I'm just like, I just want to get this fight over with because I want to go eat and take a nap, right? And nothing's happening. And now my interpreter, Ali, knew me really well, and he knew like my moods. And I was already kind of grumpy. I mean, we've been up for days. So he kind of comes walking up to me sideways, like you walk up to your dad when you don't want to get yelled at. And he kind of looks at his feet and he goes, "Commander Matt, I'm so sorry, Commander Matt. The Taliban say on the radio, it's the Greybeards. Go home and hide your guns. No one else dies today." And I was so furious that they had made me set up for an ambush and were afraid to come ambush us. I was just angry. I was like spitting mad. I was like, yeah, how do you call off your own attack, right? But that was how I learned that the Taliban had a street name for us. Like the bad guys back in Chicago would give me a street name when I was a cop, right? We were the Greybeards because we were such an old team and everybody had the Greybeards. At the time, I was still a ginger. Mine was still brick red. So kind of the point of the story is the guys that have been on that team for decades, the guys that have been there long before I got there, right? Taught me everything I needed to know about being a special forces soldier. And they kept me alive. And then in turn, I taught the junior guys on the team the lessons that kept them alive. And what I'm trying to do now with the company is keep paying that forward. I want to be able to teach the younger generation that carries a gun, whether for personal defense as a civilian, or in law enforcement or in military. I want to teach them all the lessons I can that I learned the hard way. That took me years to figure out. I want to give them to them so they don't have to go through all that wasted time. So they can shortcut their learning curve, get there quicker, don't do all the dead ends and wrong turns I took, and figure this stuff out faster. And that's why I came up with the company, and that's why I do it.